Okay, so welcome everybody to Parashat Yitro. It's Exodus chapter 18, going through to chapter through chapter 20. Does it get into 21? No, 18, 19, 20. So and Yitro is a an interesting combination Torah reading. It's got the first part of it is about Yitro, and that's how it gets its name. Yitro, Moses' father-in-law. And then the second part is the whole story of getting the Torah at Mount Sinai. And that basically is, that's what it is. So, of course, one of the big questions is there some integral connection, or is it just happenstance that they sort of like go one chapter to the next? That's the way it is. It's the way it happened. Or is there more to it? So anyway, these are the two sections, and we can look at whatever it is. If there's something that somebody wants to particularly highlight, this is your chance. Going once. Going twice. All right, going 3 times, that's it. So with your permission, then I'm gonna broach this subject a little and look at it in a certain kind of way. The subject of what's the connection between these two pieces? What's the connection between the first half of the Torah reading and the second half of the Torah reading? And specifically, the question is often couched as a question of how do we understand the chronology? How do we understand the timeline here? The simplest way to understand what's going on is that the story goes from one episode to the next episode to the next episode. One thing happened and the next thing happened and the next thing happened. And if we read it that way, then chapter 18 happens before chapter 19 and chapter 20 and 21. And that's the straightforward way of looking at it. That means that the Yitro story comes before the Mount Sinai story. So there is a little bit of a difficulty with that. The difficulty basically is that Yitro comes, and first there's a family reunion, and Moses and Yitro hug and kiss each other, and they do a little ritual ceremony of Thanksgiving. And then as Yitro is portrayed staying there, the next morning he wakes up and he sees that Moses is knocking himself out, teaching Torah, judging the people, and so on. So if this is before Mount Sinai, the question is, so what's the whole legal system that he's supervising? What's the whole legal system that he's putting into effect? So you might say, well, they had certain rules and regulations. They had to be a functioning society, so it may not be the worst question, the most compelling question, but it was a pretty disturbing question for a lot of people. And in that scene would fit so much better if we imagined it as happening post the giving of the Torah. So I'm going to screen share, I hope. And here we have the first verse. This is chapter 18 in Exodus. That's verse 1. Yitro heard everything that God had done. And then we have here, what I did was I'm presenting here the Ibn Ezra as one of the various commentators that talks about this issue. So I'd like to invite somebody to read it out loud for us, please.
I'll read.
Thank you. So read down here, and Yitro heard, please.
And Yitro heard Above it, the Torah mentioned the matter of Amalek, for they came to Rephidim. So it would have been appropriate for, in the 3rd month, to be written after the section about Amalek, for there it is written, and they traveled from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai. If so, why did the matter of Yitro intrude between the sections?
So let's just, here he's giving not only the kind of question that I basically outlined before, but he's saying also, if you look at the text of the Torah, the end of chapter 17 is the story of Amalek. That Amalek comes and attacks the Jewish people for no reason, and God swears that there's going to be an eternal battle with evil until they're finally destroyed. We should remember them forever. Hold on a second. There. We have to let somebody in. So that's one thing. So he says that, therefore, if you look at chapter 17, it says that all of this Amalek episode takes place at Rephidim. Then when you get to B'chodesh HaShlishi in the 3rd month, Exodus 19, it says that they traveled from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai, and then they encamped at Mount Sinai. So if you were looking at this text editorially, the Rephidim is Amalek, and then they left where they fought Amalek and they came to Mount Sinai. There's a seamless transition from chapter 17 to chapter 19. Chapter 18 is Yitro. So why is Yitro in between? Why does Yitro separate these two statements? They were in Rephidim, they had a battle, they left Rephidim, and they came to Mount Sinai. And Yitro is placed in the middle. So why does he intrude? Okay, back to you, Sarita.
Now I will explain why the section of Yitro entered in this place. This is because, since it mentioned above the evil that Amalek did to Israel, it mentioned the good that Yitro did for Israel. And it is written, and Yitro was delighted over all the good. And he gave a good and proper counsel to Moses and Israel. And Moses said to him, may you be as eyes for us, because he, Yitro, enlightened their eyes.
Okay, so how do we understand, what is Ibn Ezra's understanding? He is of the opinion that actually there's a chronological shift, that Yitro came afterwards. Yitro did not come before. The smooth reading is first Amalek, then Mount Sinai, then Yitro after. But Yitro is put in here ahead of time. Why?
It's kind of like he's saying that that perhaps you wouldn't want to have, this wonderful giving of the Torah section be right after such a terrible thing. And so let's think of that something good before we get to talking about that, right? Let's look, yeah.
All right, so it just feels nicer to go into the Torah being given with a happy story first.
It's bad enough you have to end a parsha with such a downer, if you think about it.
Right. Well, the way we end the parsha is that that God swears that God's will always be on the lookout for Amalek, and eventually God will win. So it's both negative and positive. So is it just about that? Then we could have sort of said, well, let's take the manna story. The manna story is a nice story, bread from heaven. That could have been a nice story to lead us into the Torah being given at Mount Sinai. There's something a little bit more specific about what kind of good and what kind of bad we're dealing with. It's not just downer stories. There's something specifically evil and specifically good that is being juxtaposed. What is that?
Well, it's offering a balance of a righteous Gentile as opposed to Amalek. Precisely.
What Ibn Ezra, and he's not the only one who says this, is saying is that if we would have had the Amalek story and then we would have read the Torah story, the giving of the Torah, it would have been, we would have taken the meta narrative, the bigger narrative of not just this piece and that piece. The bigger narrative is, look at those goyim. Those goyim are so out to get us, and they're so out to destroy us. And we are Israel because we have the Torah, and we have God on our side. And the message would have been a message of conflict and of estrangement. So what Ibn Ezra says is that, so the Torah goes out of its way, right? The Torah basically literally bends over backwards. It takes a story that should have come later and it puts it here, says Ibn Ezra, so that we should, as readers of the Torah, not be poisoned by the Amalek story. So that we have a counterbalance to those terrible Amalekites, and we can understand, guess what? The whole world is not Amalek. The whole world is not out to get us. So that when we take the Torah and we embrace the Torah, it's not out of a negative feeling against the rest of the world. It's going to be a feeling that's different, right? We can understand, here's this man, he enlightened our eyes. The world is a mixed bag, and now we have to find our place in the world. That's part of what he's saying. So I want to talk about that meta thing just for a half a second. When we read the Torah, often I say, let's just look at what we have right here. Let's pay attention to the little piece that we've got right here. And I believe that that's a very important part of being a responsible reader. But what Ibn Ezra is also saying is that there's a flow to the Torah. There's a kind of an ongoing step-by-step unfolding of the Torah, and that has an effect on us. That has an effect on our reading. How we choose to read the Torah is, comes out of the cumulative effect of how the Torah has how we've experienced the Torah. So this is, there's a phrase, a term, reader reception, right? There's this text, a novel, a classic, whatever it is, and that's always staying the same. But how do people take it? How do people process it? How do people digest this thing? So here we have the Torah, according to Ibn Ezra. The Torah is concerned about a possible misreading of itself. The Torah is trying to control, to a certain extent, and of course no text can control how it's going to be read, but the Torah is going out of its way to be read a certain way and not a different way, right? So that it can be read with a kind of an equanimity vis-a-vis the world, rather than a sense of victimhood or hatred vis-a-vis the world. That's a pretty amazing, I think, viewpoint that is presented here. And I want to look at this a little bit more. Okay, if we look at some other texts, we will be able to see how some of this dynamic and struggle can play out. Because in the end, the question is, what does it mean for us to have this Torah? This is a perpetual, perennial question for every Jew and for every Jewish society. What does our separateness mean in context of the rest of the world? There's a famous, phrase that we have in this Torah portion, in chapter 19. If we turn to page 437, 437 in the Eitz Chaim, this is chapter 19, verse 6. No, verse 5. Verse 5. So where's our birthday boy? Where are you? Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, so you know what? How about, can you do us the honors? Read verses 5 and 6.
Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be treasured possession among all the peoples.
You shall be my treasured possession, right?
To be my treasured possession among all the people. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel.
This is God telling Moses what to convey, the message to convey to the rest of the people. And the word we have here is Am Segula, often translated chosen people. Right? If you accept the Torah, you're the chosen people. So here we have it, black on white. This is the famous question. If we're special, if we're unique, if we're different, how does that difference sit vis-a-vis the rest of the world? How do we see that difference? So we're going to go now to a midrash. This is from the Mechilta. The Mechilta is usually a halachic midrash on the book of Exodus, because the book of Shemot, Exodus, has plenty of halacha in it. But of course, we're still introducing a lot of stories yet, and the story of getting the Torah. So this is a classic story, and many people have heard this story. It's a story, I know in my own experience, when my son was a little kid, and he was just getting introduced to the Torah in Jewish day school, whatever it is, first grade, second grade, they would make a pageant. You're going to start learning Chumash, and they would act out this story. Okay, and it always, well, I don't want to prejudice it too much, but I'll say it anyway. It always gave me the creeps. I always felt that it was really such a terrible decision to do this, and the obliviousness of it was always shocking to me. But here it is. It's a part of our tradition, and people have embraced this story for millennia. We're going to start over here, where it says, and it was for the following reason. Okay, reading it in the context of all this would be a very interesting exercise, but we're not going to do it. We're going to start from here. Okay, Alan.
Okay. And it was for the following, I remember this story. I never liked this one. And it was for the following reason that the nations of the world
will do the next one.
And it was for the following reason that the nations of the world were asked to accept the Torah, in order that they should have no excuse for saying, had we been asked, we would have accepted it. For behold, they were asked, and they refused to accept it, for it is said, and he said, the Lord came from Sinai, etc., Deuteronomy 33:2. He appeared to the children of Esau, the wicked, and said to them, will you accept the Torah? They said to him, what is written in it? He said to them, thou shalt not murder. They then said to him, that the very heritage which our father left us was, and by thy sword shall thou live. He then appeared to the children of Ammon and Moab. He said to them, will you accept the Torah? They said to him, what is written in it? He said to them, thou shalt not commit adultery. They said to him that they were all of them children of adulterers. And it is said, they were both the daughters of Lot with the child by their father. Then he appeared to the children of Ishmael. He said to them, will you accept the Torah? They said to him, what is written in it? He said to them, thou shalt not steal. They then said to him, the very blessing that had been pronounced upon our father was, and he shall be a wild ass as wild as a wild ass of a man. His hand shall be upon everything. And it is written, for indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. But when he came to the Israelites, at his right hand was a fiery law unto them. They all opened their mouths and said, all that is the Lord has spoken, we will do and obey. And
okay,
says,
the rest of the thing we don't have to go through. It's just a continuation. We get the message. That's the story. And as a parent, I remember sitting there in the audience, and they think this is such a cute story to tell. Will you take the Torah? No, because we love to steal. Will you take the Torah? No, we're murderers. No, we're rapists. No, we're whatever. The kind of stuff that our former head of this country said about all kinds of other people that tried to come into this country, and it turned my stomach. But here it is. This is the Midrash celebrating the difference between us and them. We said Nasa ben Ishma, but all those other peoples, by the way, all of them are cousins of ours, all of them are moral reprobates of the worst order, right? They do all kinds of, they do every single thing that's in the 10 Commandments, of course, which is part of what's being quoted here. You know, they couldn't accept the 10 Commandments because they violate every single, every single one of them. So they were given a chance. They were given a chance to get the Torah, but they, are just terrible human beings, and they refused it. Yeah, Michael.
The irony of all this is that according to our tradition, they are commanded to do these things that they were asking about. They are commanded to not to steal, not to kill, not to commit adultery.
Right.
The things that
Right.
they're not commanded according to our tradition is to necessarily believe in God. They're allowed to have their own gods, but
Right. That's the section starting from here.
yeah.
That talks about your point. So I wanted to skip over that point, but you're right. They even, and what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says is they can't even keep the commandments that they're supposed to keep, let alone all the other commandments. The 7 mitzvot of Bnei Noach they couldn't keep. So what do you expect? But this is just piling it on. This is piling it on in the Midrash. That so yeah, they can't even do these things. They can't even accept the most basic laws of human morality. So it's a terrible indictment of the nations of the world. And it's this basic kind of sense of we are special and everybody else sucks, right? So that's the statement here. And it's as I said, it's unfortunate that it's read as it's taken as almost an innocuous, wonderful story. I had some fights with saying, no, this has to be eliminated. You better do a different Chumash pageant because this is bad. But it had to be brought up. It wasn't obvious to everybody. And it's not obvious because guess what? It's a very deeply entrenched feeling among many Jews. And you don't have to necessarily be pious and observant. Jewish racism, Jewish anti-Goyism is strong and alive in every area of the Jewish community, one way or the other. Okay, any other comments about this? Okay, now it's going to be Sarita's turn. So here's another midrash. This midrash comes from Eicha, Lamentations, Eicha Rabbah. Midrash Rabbah is the grand collection of midrash, and it's a midrashic collection on the 5 books of Moses, and then on selected other books. And this is the midrash on Eicha, and of course Eicha is the lamenting of the Jewish people with the destruction of the temple, the first temple, Babylonian exile. So there's exile, uprootedness, loss of life, mourning. It's an aching book, and this is a very moving text that goes on and on and on, almost verse by verse on each verse in the book of Eicha, and expands upon it. So here the printing is not so good, but this is Ani Agever Ra Ani. That's the first verse in chapter 3 of Eicha. Sarita, you see where we are over here? We're going to start from here,
Yeah.
Rabbi Yoshua of Siknin. Okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Rabbi Joshua of Siknin, whoops, you got to keep still, said in the name of Rav Levi, I am the man. The community of Israel said, I am indeed experienced in sufferings. What pleaseth thee is beneficial to me. It may be likened to a king who has enraged.
Just wait before we get into the liken, before we get into the parable. What he says, the verse says, Ani hagever ra ani. I am the person, I'm the man who has seen so much suffering. And the way now it's being explained is, I'm suffering, but I know that it's all for the good, right? It's a kind of an acquiescence to whatever you do, your God, you know best. And I'm sure that, it's all for the good. But now let's see what happens with this parable. It may be likened.
It may be likened to a king who has enraged against his consort and drove her out of the palace.
Who's the king?
Um,
God.
Yeah.
Who's the consort? The people of Israel.
Israel, yeah.
Right. So God gets
Us.
angry. The king gets angry at his consort at the queen, and kicks her out, exiles her. Okay, so that's the parable. Okay, go ahead.
She went and pressed her face against the pillar. It happened that the king passed and saw her and said to her, "You are acting impudently." She replied, "My lord king, so it is seemly and right and proper for me to do, seeing that no other woman except me has accepted you." He retorted, "It was I who disqualified all other women from marriage with me for your sake." She said to him, "If that is so, why did you enter such and such a side street, such and such a court and place? Was it not on account of a certain woman who rejected you?" Similarly spake the Holy One, blessed be he, to Israel. "You are acting impudently." They replied, "Lord of the universe, so is it seemly and right and proper for us to do, seeing that no other nation except us accepted the Torah?" He retorted, "It is I who disqualified all other nations from accepting it for your sake." They said to him, "If that is so, why didst thou carry thy Torah around to the nations for them to reject it? For it has been taught that first he revealed himself to the sons of Esau. That is what is written. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and rose from Seir unto them, but they rejected it. Then he offered it to the sons of Ishmael, who rejected it, as it is written, he shined forth from Mount Paran. Finally, he offered it to Israel, who accepted it, as it is written, and he came forth from the myriads holy. At his right hand was a fiery law unto them. And it is also written, all that the Lord hath spoken will we do and obey.
Okay, so this is a text that is in the same family with the text we just read, right? The text before. It has the same motif of we got the Torah, we accepted the Torah, we said Na'aseh v'nishma, everything that God says, we will listen and we will obey. And it has the motif of God going around to the other nations. It starts with that same verse from Deuteronomy, that God offered the Torah to Ishmael, God offered the Torah to Esau, etc., etc., etc. They all rejected. So that's all part of the same family of stories. But by being couched in this parable and the way that the story is told, it's very different. How do we see differences? The people, what kind of differences can we discern here? Why did the other nations reject the Torah in this version?
It seems like they were set up to do so, but
So the first thing that we have to notice is it doesn't tell us.
right.
In the other story, it tells us that the nations of the world rejected the Torah because this one didn't want to stop stealing, this one didn't want to stop sexual immorality, this one didn't want to stop killing. So they didn't want to accept the Torah because they wanted to keep on sinning. They wanted to keep on doing all the terrible things that they did. That's what we had explicitly in the previous version. Here, it keeps on saying that this one rejected the Torah, this one, but it doesn't actually say reasons. If we want to look for any reasons at all, we have to go back to the parable. When we go back to the parable, let's see what is that actual interchange between the king and the consort. So the king says, what are you doing here? I kicked you out of the palace. Why are you still hanging around and you're still crying, which is what Eicha is. Eicha is we're crying, we're reaching out to God, we're bemoaning what happened. And God says, can't you get a hint? I kicked you out. Goodbye. and the children of Israel or the consort turned back to God. Let's take the consort, right? What does this queen, this rejected queen, say to the king?
I'm the only one that likes you.
Yeah, why are you kicking me out? Nobody else wants you.
Right. The one person in the world who was willing to put up with you, you're kicking out. Guess what? There isn't a single other woman that you ever approached who was willing to hang out with you. And God said, "Oh, no, are you kidding? Anybody would be happy to have me, but I chose you." And she says, "Oh yeah, I saw you try to make a pass at that woman, and when you went around the corner to that, and the woman wouldn't give you the time of day. I saw you when you went to that bar and you tried to pick up that other person, and she laughed at you." So, according to this image, who's rejecting who?
But it's also, so what does it mean to be chosen if I went to all these others and they wouldn't have me? And so now, I'm finally getting to you, right?
Well,
yeah.
So again, I think that this is so contemporaneous. Not for me, but when I think about the torture of dating that people have to go through today, when I think about what young people have to endure to try to find a person who's possibly a good match for them, you have to go through terrible efforts, and you go through this person and that person and this person and that person. And look, some of the people that you meet, let's say online or whatever it is, are creeps, or you meet them in the old days, at a dance or or in a bar or something. They're ridiculous. But plenty of people are fine, but they're not yours. They're not your match, and that you're not interesting to them. And then finally, after you go through the rounds and you go through, you're almost ready to give up trying to go out on a date. Finally, one person that you meet says, "You know what? There's something about this schmo that I like." And what the heck? Let's keep talking. And then one thing leads to another. That's the image that you have here. The queen is saying, "I'm the only one who ever gave you the time of day." Doesn't that mean something? You are the one who failed when other people rejected you. You didn't interest them. You didn't turn them on. You didn't, you weren't, fascinating enough. You weren't, magnetic enough. The shoe is on the other foot here. The first story of rejection is putting down every single nation as being, totally disgusting. Here, this is a very radical kind of throwing it back in God's face and saying, God, you could have, maybe you should have tucked your shirt in your pants the last time you actually went over to that woman and asked her to dance. Maybe you could have cleaned your act up a little bit. Maybe you could have figured out a better pickup line. If you didn't get accepted by the rest of the world, maybe it's not the rest of the world's fault. Maybe you just didn't do your best. Or maybe it's just not meant to be. And we're meant to be. And now, because we have a fight, you're trying to get rid of me. I'm the only one in this world that loves you. Yeah, Michael.
From the texts that are supplied, it looks like part of the reason that the match didn't work out was simply a matter of geography. They say, "Oh no, we can't get together. You're from Sinai. I'm from Har Seir. I'm from Mount Paran.
Those
we have our own gods here. You have
God is knocking on every door. God is going to all these places. The geographic problem does not exist for God. If God was be accepted by the people in Har Seir, God would be in Har Seir. If God would be, that's the whole thing. God goes all over. That's the business about God going into the streets and into the going down the alley and so on. God has been trying to pick up these consorts everywhere. God is not far away. God is just not making it. God's not making the connection. He tries, and he can't. So believe me, he's got the limo. He's got the the infinite Metro card. He can get wherever he wants. But I think we should really see this as that kind of really very radical overturning of the previous story, where it's throwing it back on God and saying, we have a mysterious thing going here, and we are the only ones who have this love, this chemistry between us. Why are you throwing it away? Why are you throwing it away, God? So it's coming back at God with that kind of feeling. It's a chosen, treasured people, but not at the expense of anybody else. It's not putting anybody else down, right? It's taking the marriage metaphor or the love metaphor, which we find in the prophets and so on, and taking it absolutely seriously. When two people decide that they love each other, it reflects on nobody else in the entire world, right? It's just the mystery of that chemistry. Yeah, Serena.
So, but this seems to be suggesting that, okay, the issue of putting it with the idea of trying to evaluate what does it mean to be chosen. This does seem to be saying that you didn't necessarily choose me. You kept looking. I chose you.
That's right.
And so in some sense, it's I guess it's not as mutual as I would like it to be, because what you're presenting is this idea that you meet a lot of people and it's blameless. You just don't always click, and that's on both sides. Something has to click on both sides. Here, it seems to be a little bit more slanted to you kept looking and kept on looking, but I was interested. I chose. So why reject me? Because I did choose you. Yeah.
Well, again, how much you want to push a parable is up to you. But I think that this is, again, true to human relationships. People get together, not, I advocate, let's say, a celebration of mutuality when people decide to get married. But mutuality doesn't mean evenness. Mutuality doesn't mean that everything is exactly 50-50 and exactly the same on both sides. Each person has their own emotional makeup. Each person has their own personality. And one person can be a lot more of an initiator than another person in a relationship. You've heard stories. I've heard stories. I've been waiting for this guy to propose to me for the last 20 years. We're still together, but he never, goes the next step. There has to be, somebody has to, make a move somewhere along the line. And it doesn't necessarily come from a complete, simultaneous, climax for both of them. So that's part of what's reality here as well. You go out on a date, and then you go out on another one, you go on another one. Finally, you find somebody that actually returns your phone calls. And, who's the one who's more in love with the other one? Who's choosing who? Not so clear. Not so clear. And then it works out, or doesn't. We have time for a little bit more. This is from Tana Devei Eliyahu, which is a wonderful, amazing midrash. It's a later midrash than the other midrashim. It's a really very cool book, and its basic theme is a celebration of the Torah in many, many different ways, and we'll get a little taste of how that works here also. The protagonist is, as I said, it's called Tana Deve Eliyahu, teachings from the house of Eliyahu. And Eliyahu, the prophet, is sort of like the narrator or the main protagonist, sort of. It's a complicated book. But what happens is he goes running around the world and he encounters different people and tells about the teachings, Torah teachings that ensue from these encounters. So actually a book that has a little bit of an influence on the Zohar. Okay, my questioner. Okay, who's gonna read this one?
You want me to keep going? Or
Sure.
Alan, would you like to read again?
I'll read.
Yeah.
Just gotta move the stickler.
Can you read it? Can you see it?
Alan, can you see
Yeah,
it?
I just gotta move because I brought okay. My questioner said to me further, my master, two things in my heart I love with a very great love, Torah and Israel, but I do not know which of them to put first. I replied, generally, people say that Torah is to be put first, in keeping with the verse in the Torah, which says, the Lord made me as the beginning of his way. But I would say Israel come first, in keeping with the verse, Israel is the Lord's hallowed portion, his first fruits of the increase, to show that Israel is to be put first. Consider the following parable of a king with wife and children in his household. The king published an edict, but his subjects refused to accept it. Were it not for the queen and the princes who with their customary loyalty to the king, undertook to present the edict again to the people, it would never have reached them. That it did become available to them was due to the queen and the princes who, acting as the king's envoys, took the edict to the people. In short, Israel, as king's helpmeet, took up the rejected Torah and has ever since been preaching it to the other nations of the world. Hence, Israel is the Lord's hallowed portion. Torah, to be sure, says, the Lord made me as the beginning of his way. Nevertheless, in Israel, there's a quality so appealing to him that Israel can claim precedence from saying, from afar, the Lord appeared unto me saying, yea, I love thee with an everlasting love.
Okay, so again, we can notice the motif of the rejected Torah and the motif of the king and the consort, the king and the queen. So here we have those, traditional motifs, and here they're played out in a slightly different way, right? What's the story here?
Here is the king who comes out with something unpopular, and he needs his loyal family to convince the subjects to comply with the laws.
So so the unpopular edict, that's the Torah that was rejected by everybody else in the family. The whole world is God's family. However, the queen and her children,
princes,
they don't give up on the Torah. And because they're loyal to the king and because they're willing to keep the Torah, that keeps the Torah alive. And then eventually they're able to persuade the rest of the family to accept the Torah too.
It sounds like a pretty missionary undertaking.
The end of Aleinu, on that day, the whole world will finally recognize and accept God as the one God. Yeah, for sure. That's the hope. The hope in the end is everybody will recognize there is one God. God created all of us. The problem is not everybody gets that. So this story is presented again with a very different evaluation of what the rejection of the Torah means. In the very first story, it was the rejection was guaranteed. There's no way that the rest of the world would accept the Torah because the rest of the world is the antithesis of the values of the Torah. Right? The second version says, well, what do you want to do? I mean, when there's no chemistry, there's no chemistry, but we have the chemistry for this particular way of relating to you. This story says it's not working yet, but the fact that it hasn't worked yet doesn't mean that it won't work in the future. It's gonna be possible for the whole royal family, right? To all be Mamlechet Kohanim B'Goy Kadosh. It's going to be possible for every people in the world to have that kind of loyal sense of relationship with the king. It's a totally, flipped around vision. I want to come back to our Ibn Ezra. What does he make? What's the point that he makes at the very end? He says, Amalek bad, Yitro good. So that's why we have to balance out that so we shouldn't have that bad taste in our mouth. We're going to take Amalek off to the side and neutralize the Amalek story with the good non-Jew story, the Yitro story. But he goes beyond that, right? He says, may you be as eyes for us because Yitro enlightened the eyes of Israel. And this is not just a metaphor or a parable. This is the literal truth. The Torah reading Yitro has two pieces to it. The second piece tells of Torah that's being given to us by God. The first piece tells of Torah, it's equally Torah, given to us by a non-Jew, by a human being and not a Jew, not even Moses, but by Yitro. There are two sources of the Torah, of giving the Torah in our Torah reading, and that's part of this openness that is possible if we choose to read it that way. Of course, not everybody did. And that's that first midrash for sure. And in various other ways, the other midrashim are still struggling with it. But the idea that the fact that we have a Torah doesn't reflect in any way on the possibilities of a loving relationship between God and any other person, and the person themselves seeing things in the world, seeing things about how God needs to be served. Remember, Yitro is a priest in Midian. It's not exclusive. It's not a zero-sum game. If we've got it, nobody else can have anything like it. Yeah, Sarita.
So I'm thinking, like on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we talk about, first we have to work on our relationship with our fellow human beings before we can sort of go to God and seek God's forgiveness and the relationship with God. And that seems to be perhaps, here, that relationship and that openness to hearing what another person has to say is perhaps a necessary condition for being able to hear what God has to say.
Yeah, good. And that's part of Yitro's lesson. What does Yitro actually say to Moshe? He says, respect the other people. Give the other people a chance to be part of this system, right? You can't do it all your own. You're special. It's true, right? The whole question actually can even be seen in that question of Moses in relation to everybody else. Moses is the chosen person, right? Beyond anybody else, ever. And then Yitro comes to him and says, you're going to kill this people by just being the only one who's chosen. You're going to have to involve everybody else. You're going to have to take people who can get it and then let them be part of this. So it's not only you. That insight doesn't come from God, doesn't come from Moses. It comes from Yitro. That's a fundamental teaching that we have. All right. Any other comments, Alan? You wanted to say something?
No, I would just add from what we talked before. That to be Am Skula. How do you be a prince if there's no subjects? In other words, you can't become a prince amongst nations unless you're engaging with those other nations and actually being, an example to them. And you can't wall yourself off and say they're bad, I'm good, because then you're really creating that wall between you. You've got to embrace them.
So again, I just want to contextualize the Eicha story. You know, it's great to be loving to other people. It's hard to be loving to other people or to God if they're hitting you over the head, if they're brutalizing you, right? So that's part of the struggle also, right? All right, we're going to leave that. I'm going to stop that. And okay, Sei gesund und stark.
Yes, Koach.
You will.